Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most surreal, absolutely high-stakes global standoffs happening right now. And it's wild because this is a massive geopolitical clash involving the world's biggest superpowers, but it's not taking place over major cities or, vast stretches of land. Instead, this intense power struggle is literally playing out over invisible, submerged rocks and tiny coral reefs right in the middle of the ocean. And the crazy thing? The outcome of this could impact everything from your local economy to global security. Okay, let's dive into this, because the reality out there on the water, it's shockingly violent. Back in 2024, at a submerged reef known as Second Thomas Shoal, there was this absolutely terrifying face-off. You had the massive military might of China directly confronting the island nation of the Philippines. We are talking about Chinese Coast Guard and naval personnel actually wielding machetes, sticks, and firing high-speed water cannons against Filipino sailors. In the absolute chaos of this clash, a Filipino sailor actually lost a finger. And this wasn't just some one-off incident either. Around the same time, over at another reef called Scarborough Shoal, a Chinese military helicopter flew incredibly dangerously close. We're talking just 3 meters away from a small Philippine Cessna aircraft. A mid-air collision right there could have easily triggered an all-out war. So you might be wondering, why on earth are these nations willing to risk global conflict over seemingly worthless rocks? Well, it's because the South China Sea is literally one of the most critical arteries on the entire planet. Roughly 1/3 of all global maritime trade passes right through this terrifyingly tense battleground. To put that into perspective, the electronics you buy, the fuel you use, the whole global economy really, relies on these waters staying open. The stakes are almost impossibly high. And that's exactly why China claims nearly 90% of these waters, while the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Taiwan all claim overlapping slices of the exact same pie. To truly understand how this incredibly vital waterway became such a powder keg, here's our agenda for today. We'll start with the clash at the shoals, then trace the origins of the Nine-Dash Line. Next, we'll look at law versus historical claims, move on to mastering gray zone tactics, and finally unpack geopolitics and national pride. Section 1. Clash at the shoals. A rusty ship, and a modern standoff. Let's start right on the front lines to understand the sheer human and tactical desperation driving this conflict today. The incredible story of the BRP Sierra Madre highlights this perfectly. Way back in 1999, the Philippines took a really bold measure. They intentionally ran a rusting 1949 World War II-era ship aground, directly onto Second Thomas Shoal. Why do that? Well, it was to create a makeshift, permanent military outpost. Today, over 25 years later, that ship is practically disintegrating into the sea. Yet there's still a small group of Filipino Marines living on this perilous, rusting wreckage, completely surrounded by modern Chinese vessels that are constantly trying to block their food and supply drop-offs. It's this visceral David and Goliath scene, and it's playing out in slow motion right before our eyes. Section 2. Origins of the Nine-Dash Line. How maps shifted from trade routes to territory. Let's see how this all builds, because this modern clash actually has roots that stretch back centuries. If we look at ancient Chinese maps from the 16th century, these tiny islands were clearly marked as shelters for trade routes. Archaeologists have even found ancient Chinese ceramics and coins out there. But, back then, nobody was claiming sovereignty over random ocean rocks. That whole idea changed in the 1930s when French forces in Indochina, which is modern-day Vietnam, claimed the islands. Then, during World War II, Japan took over, building submarine docks and seaplane bases, effectively becoming the first single power to control the entire sea. After Japan's defeat, a newly empowered nationalist Chinese government sent ships to the Spratly Islands in 1946 and officially drew up an 11-dash line on a map to claim the territory. When Mao Zedong's communists won the Civil War in 1949, they adopted this exact map, though they eventually erased 2 dashes to give the Gulf of Tonkin to their communist allies in North Vietnam. And just like that, the infamous Nine-Dash Line was born. Now, for a while, this was just lines on paper. But then, in the late 1960s, everything escalated dramatically. Massive oil and natural gas reserves were discovered right beneath the seafloor. Suddenly, these rocks were worth billions. This ignited a really fierce race, culminating in a deadly 1974 clash at the Paracel Islands, where Chinese forces fought the South Vietnamese. That battle resulted in the deaths of 70 Vietnamese soldiers and actually cemented China's permanent military presence right there. Section 3. Law versus historical claims, a clash of global frameworks. So how does the world handle this massive collision between modern international rules and deeply rooted historical claims? The crucial point is this. To stop the fighting, the international community created UNCLOs. That's the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This modern law basically dictates that a country owns 12 nautical miles off its coast and then has an exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, extending up to 200 nautical miles. The Philippines relies entirely on this modern framework. And here's the fascinating part. China actually helped negotiate and sign UNCLOs. However, China's historical 9-line extends thousands of miles, pushing right up against the coastlines of its neighbors. So when the new 200 nautical mile law conflicted with their historical map, China chose to prioritize their ancient history over the modern UN framework. This fundamental disagreement eventually went all the way to the International Court in The Hague. In 2016, the court delivered a major landmark ruling. They declared the 9-line illegal and affirmed that the contested shoals belong firmly within the Philippine EEZ. But China completely rejected the ruling. They called it meaningless and insisted their sovereignty is based on 2,000 years of discovery and naming of the sea. Section 4. Mastering Gray Zone Tactics. Winning without fighting a war. If international courts can't enforce the rules, it ultimately comes down to tactics on the water. So, how does China maintain a 22-kilometer exclusion zone around places like Scarborough Shoal without starting a full-blown war? The answer is gray zone tactics. This is a highly effective, though incredibly intimidating strategy. By definition, these are aggressive actions kept deliberately below the threshold of conventional warfare. You see, China knows perfectly well that the Philippines has a strict mutual defense treaty with the United States. If China fires a missile or uses conventional military force, the U.S. is obligated to get involved. So China meticulously calibrates its aggression to stay right beneath that line. They win control without ever firing a single bullet. So how exactly do they pull this off? Well, instead of sending in standard gray Navy warships, they use massive Coast Guard vessels and what are known as maritime militias. These are essentially paramilitary forces perfectly disguised as ordinary fishermen. These armadas will literally swarm Philippine boats. They use military-grade lasers to temporarily blind pilots and sailors. They fire those high-speed water cannons we mentioned earlier, which can shatter glass and destroy equipment. They physically ram smaller boats, and they form impenetrable naval blockades. It's a strategy completely designed to mentally exhaust and physically block the opponent until they just have no choice but to give up. And this brilliantly illustrates the ultimate gray zone maneuver, literally changing the physical geography of the Earth. Seriously, it's wild. China has dredged immense amounts of sand directly from the ocean floor and then dumped it onto 7 submerged reefs in the Spratly Islands to build massive artificial land masses. Once the land is built, they pave these new islands, installing military runways, radar stations, and missile launch pads. They have effectively built a fleet of permanent, unsinkable aircraft carriers right in the middle of the sea. This allows them to project military power thousands of miles away from their mainland. Section 5. Geopolitics and National Pride. The Century of Humiliation. To truly grasp why compromise seems almost impossible here, we have to look past the law, past the oil, and examine the deep psychological drivers of this conflict. For Chinese President Xi Jinping, dominating the South China Sea is fundamentally tied to national pride and reversing what is known as the Century of Humiliation. This was a historical period where Western powers in Japan carved up and exploited China. Overcoming this is a central pillar of modern Chinese national pride. Reclaiming the sea is seen as absolutely essential to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's so deeply ingrained, in fact, that the 9-line map is literally watermarked onto the pages of modern Chinese passports. Giving up even an inch of this territory would be seen domestically as a catastrophic sign of weakness. As you can imagine, this creates a wildly complex geopolitical web. On one hand, you have China aggressively pushing for national rejuvenation. On the other, the Philippines, under President Marcos Jr., is pushing back hard by tightening its military alliance with the U.S. But the U.S. stance, it's complicated. They want to promote a rules-based order, but shifting domestic politics, like the unpredictability of a Trump presidency, creates deep anxiety for Asian allies who rely on American protection. Meanwhile, the broader ASEAN bloc of Southeast Asian nations mostly stays silent on the issue. Why? Because their entire domestic economies are just so incredibly reliant on Chinese trade. And that silence perfectly highlights the implicit strategic offer China makes to its neighbors. Give up some sovereignty, and in return, you will be safe and economically rewarded. It's a brutal, high-stakes tug-of-war between a nation's sovereign pride and its sheer economic survival. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves who pays the ultimate price while superpowers play this giant game of geopolitical chess. Beyond the international courts and the newly paved military bases, the immediate victims are the ordinary people. Generations of fishermen who once freely navigated places like Scarborough Shoal are now trapped, jobless, and completely cut off from their historical livelihoods. When ancient history clashes with modern law and superpowers rewrite the rules of the sea, it's always those ordinary voices caught in the crossfire that are silenced first. Thanks so much for joining me to unpack this fascinating topic, and I'll see you in the next explainer.